we could probably store the entire human genome in under 1.5 gigabytes. But when you think about that for a second, that's not 1.5 gigabytes of code. That's 1.5 gigabytes of compiled code. That's an executable size of around about 1.5 gigabytes if you're running in a base 4 system. So we've got the DNA, we've got the code, but that is pointless if we don't have a runtime. So the cell is the runtime. It's the virtual machine. It's the hardware that we deploy our code onto. And the cell itself is a rather complicated thing. It has quite a bit of structure inside it that I'm not going to go into too much depth in. There's a whole different talk there. But the cell takes all of the DNA and places it inside our nucleus. And the nucleus is the very beginning of the process of the cell's function, of the cell functioning. Because it is there that the DNA is transcribed into RNA. And that RNA makes its way out through to the out into the cell and to a ribosome. And the ribosome is a machine that then transforms that RNA into a protein. And so we can already see that there's a lot of chemical processes going on inside the cell. But they all have waste. They all basically use up space inside the cell. They produce waste. They have redundant memory. So we have the lysomes. And the lysomes are produced by the Golgi apparatus. And they themselves come along and break down large molecules. So they take away all the waste from the processing of the proteins, and they break them down into simple molecules that can be removed from the cell. And this is where the cell membrane really comes into its own. Because it's not just a wall, a sac that contains cytoplasm and all the nucleus and everything else. The cell membrane is an API, as far as I'm concerned. It allows certain chemicals through, like water and nutrients. It has receptors that listen to other messages. So chemicals can bind to those receptors and send messages across the membrane into the cell. It also allows waste products to go out of the cell. So this is what the membrane is for. It is there to produce the API to protect the cell from any kind of foreign invader, whilst allowing useful materials to pass through. And the nucleus itself contains most of the DNA. We have what's called mitochondria in our cells, and these are small parts of our cell that produce the fuel for almost every other cellular process, called ATP. And the mitochondria were probably, at one point, small bacteria that got absorbed by a larger cell. But these bacteria were really good at producing ATP. So the cell formed a symbiotic relationship with the mitochondria, kind of doing composition, if you will. And this means that we now have a highly functional cell, highly efficient, highly structured, that allows us to run our DNA efficiently and produce a variety of different organisms. But how does it go about deploying a genome? Well, we start out with one cell, and processes within the cell start to split it apart. And by doing so, it takes both halves of the double helix of the DNA and pulls it apart. And as the cell pulls apart, it can reconstruct the full double helix molecule because of the base pairs. So it can fully match the base pairs against each other and rebuild the molecule. This means that after every cell division, we have two identical copies of the same cell. Now that is probably not the end of it, because we don't reproduce in that way. So over time, we produce sexual reproduction, which means that we take two cells from two parents, we combine them together, and they have, each parent brings its own copy of each chromosome. So they're slightly different in how they might express a gene. But the combination of them is how we provide genetic diversity. But once we've created sexual reproduction, we are back into asexual reproduction to grow the organism. So we start out with one cell, and through asexual reproduction, it divides and divides and divides, and cells become more specialized to produce us. So hopefully we've now seen that we have binary code, or the equivalent of binary code in biology. We've seen that we have a runtime, a unit of deployment for our code. And we've seen that roughly we do copy-paste deployments. Now, that's quite similar to what most of what we do in the world of technology. So how do we get from where we were to where we are now? How do you get from that single cell all the way through to the variety of life that we see in front of us? Well, we do it through emergent design. We do development by mutation. We take a small iterative process and apply that many, many generations over millions of years to affect the change that we're going to see. And it's going to be driven by some evolutionary pressures. And this is going to lead to species determining whether they're going to become generalists or specialists, whether they're going to be something that can survive in most environments, or whether they're going to be something that thrives in a small environment. And then I'll talk about whether nature does really have legacy code. It does. So we saw that we divide cells via copy and paste. That's the same way that we get most of our source code onto most other computers. We copy either the code and compile it on the server, or we just copy the code from one place to another. And we know that copying software is not always a perfect process. We know that sometimes bits get flipped in transit. We know that sometimes copying and pasting fails partway through. We use an MD5 hash to validate whether what we've downloaded is correct. But nature kind of doesn't. It kind of goes, okay, it will either survive or it will fail in the world. And so nature's relying on these random mutations that can be completely random. It may lead to an organism never actually reproducing properly, never actually becoming alive because the mutation was so bad. Or it may be that you get a wonderful mutation that massively changes how that organism can survive in the environment it is in. And so all of this is virtually the same as what we do, but it's slow, in my opinion. You're waiting for something that's very random to happen. You're waiting for one change that will make something better. We don't need to do that because we don't wait for random. We don't sit there copy and pasting code for thousands of times just to see if it changes something in such a way that makes it work. We actually do more thoughtful design of our code. We actually make changes deliberately. So we should be faster than nature at making useful changes and far less random. At least, hopefully, people are far less random than I am when making changes. And so we end up with this process of iterative design. The successful criteria of any organism or any iteration of the organism or the species is that it can breed faster than the other variations. So everything is trying to find a way to interact with its environment better through these mutations. Now, nature does this on a vast scale. So in every generation, you're not talking that there might be one mutation. There may be dozens of mutations. It's doing multivariate testing with every generation. And it's a constant evolution that we have. So, for example, the flower and the bee. The flower wants the bee to be forced to pass the stamen to take pollen in order to get to the nectar. It produces nectar to attract the bee in the first place. The bee, at the same time, wants to get to the nectar in the easiest way possible. And the flower is constantly evolving. It's constant. Each generation of flower is trying to find a way to ensure that the bees pollinate it better or more effectively. And the bees are trying to get access. They're trying to get access to flower more, or to the nectar as efficiently as possible. If the flower is too open and the nectar is too available, the bees will just mostly bypass the pollen. If it's too narrow and too tight, the bees won't be able to get in to pollinate. And both of them are doing these changes at the same time. They're both trying to find better ways to exist. And so when we say there's multivariate testing, I don't think there's ever any one given constant in nature. I think everything is changing constantly, and you're trying to, and what is emerging is the best possible scenario for the given mutations that are available at the time. And as I say, this is generational. So a flower may regrow once a year. Something like a fruit fly generates a new generation about once every 10 days. And this is why we study flies quite often, because we can actually change their conditions. And over a period of months, we can actually start studying the genetic changes that happen inside that population. If it was us, our generation is about 20 to 25 years. So if we were waiting 10 generations to see if a genetic change happened, well, you're already meaning that you've got to hand down your research to several scientists. So what we'd like to see is short feedback cycles. Nature doesn't really care about the feedback cycle. It is mostly concerned about the current iteration and producing the next generation. It's not really thinking about what we would like, which is, I think, slightly further ahead, and to produce a, how can I put this? To produce something that will survive that will survive beyond this next generation, that we can continue to grow and adapt as we move forward. So That was a very good point that came up. Nature doesn't have a client. Nature is its own client in some ways. So we talk about what the evolutionary pressures are on organisms like us. So we have the very gradual change over time. As I say, change is the one constant that we are ever going to find in the universe. The world doesn't stay the same. So even now, we are moving on the continents, we are drifting around. Like places that used to be land are now completely submerged. Places that used to be completely submerged are now land. And so we see that some creatures have even gone from the sea to the land, back to the sea, back onto land again, because that's how the environment around them has evolved over time. So we can see in the top row, we can see that happening. We can see things happily swimming in the sea. But over time, that sea is vanishing. The continents are moving together. The inland sea is draining. And anything that's left in the water is going to die off if it doesn't evolve to move onto the land. So this gradual change can happen over the generations of larger animals. That larger change will come about because of over centuries, millennia. And so we can have hundreds and thousands of generations that pass the genetic changes forward to make to adapt to the changing environment. But sometimes, as the dinosaurs found out, change is actually very quick. Like the giant asteroid struck the ground. It caused massive tidal waves, killing millions of dinosaurs. Some were still around, but it also changed the climate. And changing the climate probably meant that less light was getting through to the plants. So any dinosaurs that were surviving, the herbivores weren't able to sustain themselves. And the carnivores then couldn't sustain themselves because there weren't enough herbivores to prey on. And so eventually, maybe even within a few generations, the large dinosaurs died out, which was great news for us because our ancestors were small. They were able to survive on far less food. They were able to survive in the changed climate. And so out of these small rodent-like creatures, most of the mammals evolved and became quite dominant on the planet. But we also see one other thing that kind of drives evolution, and that's competition. Now, I've drawn here a few muskox, and the males want to be bigger and stronger so that they can fight, they can defend their mates, they can assert their control over the mates to pass on their genes to the next generation. But as we've seen, it's not just having a mate that drives that change. If you've got predator and prey, the cheetah and the gazelle, for example, then competition between those becomes quite intense. They both want to run fast because if the cheetah runs faster, it's more likely to catch them. So the gazelle wants to run faster than the cheetah. And then they want to be able to change direction fast because straight line speed is probably not good enough. They want to be able to change quickly so that they can get away from the opponent. And so then the cheetah has to adapt to that. And it's a constant cycle of iteration and change. And I didn't know this until a few months back, but bats will try and use echolocation to find moths in the air so that they can catch them and eat them. And moths have evolved an unusual defense mechanism they are now starting to produce sound in the same range as the bat's echolocation. So as the bat gets too close, they produce a burst of this sound that confuses the bat, giving the moth more of a chance to escape. So what will happen next? Will the bats change the frequency range that they make a sound? It's a constant interplay between predator and prey, or between two predators. If you're both trying to get the same food, the species that's better at finding that food and obtaining that food is going to win out over time. Or, as I explained with the flowers and the bees, it's a mutual symbiotic relationship that they're trying to constantly improve. Or you could say that the flowers are actually competing for the attention of the bees. And this is the same for us. We actually have a lot of competition for the attention of our customers, or for their money. Let's be honest, we're trying to do that for the money, or for somebody else's money, like ad revenue. But it's always the same thing. We're competing for people's time and attention. The more attention that they give us, the more money we're going to get. So the same kind of things happen for us. So what could happen in changing our environment that could end up leaving us as a dinosaur, a forgotten relic? What is happening now that could change? What sudden change could happen now that makes us all pointless? And I think in the .NET community, we had something quite recently where Microsoft have introduced the new Windows Package Manager, and immediately apt-get, as an open source package, the maintainer said, there's no point in me fighting this. And suddenly we have that competition. That was a sudden change in the ecosystem that meant that there was no longer a way for that to survive. So we should be looking for these things. We should be looking for the subtle changes in our environment, the new technologies, things like the development of the cloud technologies that are making it so that the traditional way that we use our applications, or the traditional way our customers see our applications, is going to change in time. And so, what do we want to be? Do we want to be the generalist, or do we want to be the specialist? Or do we want to be somewhere in between? And as a generalist, I would say mice and rats have generally populated everywhere that they've encountered. They're quite generalist. They're small. They can adapt to eating whatever's around them. There's normally worms or other vegetation around that they can eat. So they can survive in almost any environment. Where you get something like the llama or the camel, and they both are quite close cousins in terms of species, but they both evolved to live in slightly different environments. So the llama in the more mountainous, wetter areas of South America, the camel in the drier, arid deserts of Africa. Now, they may have a common ancestor, but they haven't drifted too far from that yet. They haven't got to the point where they're totally dependent on either of those environments. Whereas the giant panda, our beloved giant panda, has become very dependent on just one food source, on bamboo. The giant panda thrived in that environment while that environment wasn't under threat. But those habitats are disappearing fast. And now we are seeing we've been seeing that the giant panda has at one point been very close to extinction. And that's because they cannot adapt as quickly as the world is adapting around them. The world is changing far too fast, mostly due to humans, for these animals ever to really survive. And I think that's the case for us. I think we have some very generalist software out there. I mean, I dare to find any company that doesn't have a process that involves a spreadsheet. One of the most generic tools that we have out there. And it's one of the most accessible tools that businesses have. Now, everybody's going to be like that. Not everybody's going to be doing functional reactive programming like people do in spreadsheets. But also, these generic tools are not that good when it comes to scale. So a spreadsheet is not going to take your company from managing its billing system for 50 customers to managing your customer for 20 million customers. So we start getting more and more specialized software. So I would say a lot of the billing systems out there are more like the llama and the camel. They're quite specialist in terms of doing billing, but they don't care what they're billing for. And then you can get even further. You can get to the point of really niche software that only exists whilst there is a need for it. So, you know, I think something like how we now trying to, I've lost the example. But any software that is so specific to what we're doing, probably actually to your business. Is there some code within your business that only exists because your business needs it? That software is going to be very specialist and possibly very sensitive to large changes in your ecosystem. And so we come on to how we've evolved. We've got some specialists, we've got some generalists, and everything has evolved from that single-celled organism. Everything has evolved from that single-celled organism. So, you know, shall we take a look and say, well, nature's designed everything perfectly. Well, it hasn't. Nature doesn't refactor. It kind of waits for that code to become useful again by random mutation. And a classic example is the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which is a nerve that runs from your brain to your jaw. Now, you'd think that would be a case of slightly down the neck and out. But in fact, it goes from your brain down under your aorta, all the way back up your neck and to your jaw. And where did this come from? Well, our jaw and ear evolved from the gills and the structures around the gills of fish. Now, a fish is a smooth, elegant body. And so the direct line to the gills from the brain was just a straight line. It didn't matter that the aorta passed over it, because that was actually quite efficient at the time. But as we evolve, we started to have more structure. We started to have a neck. And the path still was to go under the aorta. So this is how it grows. And so in the humans, it travels quite a long way to get to the jaw. But in a giraffe, it's exactly the same. We have exactly the same template, exactly the same legacy code, exactly the same redundancies in what we're doing. And, you know, nature could fix it, but there's never been a need for nature to fix it right now. Does it really matter how quickly a nerve signal gets to our jaw to tell us to chew or stop chewing? Probably not. But eventually, maybe there's an evolutionary pressure that will change that. And another little thing that we see sometimes is people develop tiny little pits at the top of their ears. here, tiny little holes, and these are effectively remnants of gills that no longer serve any purpose. They can't go scuba diving underwater without any without needing to breathe. They can't breathe in the water. They can't do anything with them. But these tiny little holes in their head are there as legacy code that's been expressed within us. And so we could do better than that. We don't have to just leave everything lying around. We can get rid of old code when we don't need it. We have source control. I mean, if we really need it back, we can really go and get it back. But we probably wouldn't. We would probably write it again. Who really goes back like 15,000 evolutions of your code base to find that one line or that one class that you thought, that'd be quite good. I think if we needed to develop gills again, which we might do with global warming, but if we want to develop gills again, then we probably end up developing them new or fresh. And this is something that we've seen before with other organs. So, for example, eyes have been developed, I think, about 30 to 50 times, according to scientists, that they've developed independently of each other. And so nature always finds ways of bringing things back if it's needed. And as I said before, we've had animals that have gone from the sea, their ancestors have come back onto the land, and then the dolphins and whales, their ancestors have gone back to the sea. They decided because of pressure from the environment, they've returned back to the sea and redeveloped fins. They've redeveloped the tail to propel them through the water. They've redeveloped a smooth body and a sleek shape to make them more efficient in the water. So, although the code is partly there to do that, I think that the code should be, from our perspective, we don't want that code lying around. We don't want, while we're making educated decisions about our code base and what changes to make inside that code, we don't need that anchor dragging us back. So far, we've seen nature as how it's been fundamentally structured, and that nature uses slow, random evolution. We can adapt. So what architecture have we ended up with? Well, I see our organs as services, as microservices, to be fair. I see that nature builds in a lot of protection by default into its architecture. I see we have direct communication as part of the human body. I see the pub-sub architecture within the body. I see learning architectures. And I think that all this is based on the adaptable standard architecture of the invertebrate. So, as I say, organs as services. I think every animal that you see has a very similar template. It has a sensory system, a musculoskeletal system, a digestive system, brain, skin. The skin will be comprised of 3 layers. Everything that we have is based around this same template. You could call it a design pattern. And most of our organs have limited numbers of responsibilities. So our heart is responsible for pumping blood around our system. The lungs are responsible for the exchange of oxygen for CO2. The kidneys are responsible for extracting waste from our bloodstream. The skeleton is responsible for moving us around. The skin is responsible for protecting us. Now, there's other things that some of the organs do, but they have limited functionality. They effectively work independently of each other, trusting that the other things will provide what they need. So the lungs need fuel and oxygen, but they can provide the oxygen themselves, but they need the fuel from the stomach, and the heart is the thing that pumps that around. They trust that the stomach exists, and that's breaking down food into glucose so that we can then process it. The brain trusts that the heart and lungs are working. It doesn't necessarily need to control them directly or control everything that they do. It needs to know that they're working correctly, and needs to know that the kidneys are working correctly, or it doesn't need to know the kidneys are working correctly. It just assumes that they're going to work correctly. So this is very much a service-based system. And you could say that they're quite loosely coupled, except for how they're packaged. We're in this meat sack that combines everything together. We can't just go easily and say, oh, I think I'd like a new pair of lungs, take them out, swap them back in. We can't do that kind of hot swapping stuff that we can do in most microservice architectures. So even though conceptually they're loosely coupled, how they're packaged and deployed has tightly coupled them together. We have protection as standard. We protect at the inputs. Our eyes protect themselves from too much light. They react by reducing our iris or even closing the eyelids should there be too much light. But also, our tears contain lysozyme, which protects us against bacteria infection. And every major entry point to our body has some form of protection there. So we're protecting the inputs that we have. But should something breach our defenses, then our body has internal systems that will try and fight to prevent this. So we have antibodies that help fight viral, fungal, and bacterial infections. By attaching themselves to these invaders, they can prevent the invaders from binding to our cells, or they can mark them for destruction by the white cells. The white blood cells come along and engulf and destroy the invaders. And they're also producing messengers within the system, so that once an infection is detected, our body starts producing more of these defenders to fight off that infection. So it's a feedback loop that allows us to react quickly when we think we're being infected. We have direct communication between our brains and our sensors. So everything that you're seeing now is going into a low-level process within your brain. You think you're seeing the entire room, but you're actually seeing probably a small fraction that's in the very center of your vision. But what your peripheral vision has is lots of motion sensors. So if something suddenly flies past you, your vision will suddenly snap to that and focus on the thing that's moving. But that means that we're not processing all the information at a high level all the time. We're looking for changes. We're looking for things that are different from the normal. And this is where we can probably look at our own systems and look at how do we know what is normal and how do we detect that change from normal and how quickly can we detect that change. And we also have direct communication from our brains to our muscles to make us move around, to make us talk. I can't speak to you now without neurons firing across my body to explain to make the muscles move, to make the sounds that I need to do to speak to you. But again, we also have reflexes. Now, they don't need the central processing unit. If you put your hand on something hot, they don't need your brain to go, oh, wait, he's put his hand on something hot. What I should do is take the hand away. Your hand is already moving away as the message is reaching your brain, because it gets to your spine, and we've developed a reflex action that then immediately sends a signal to your muscle saying, move hand. And The brain can override that. The brain can go, no, 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 really do put your hand on there if it wants to be a bit masochistic. But by default, the reflex saves lives. And do we have an equivalent inside our own systems? We have, as I've been alluding to, a pub-sub architecture inside our own code. This is the endocrine system. It's a major communication system for our body. So much of our body communicates via hormones. And the classic example is going to be if you feel threatened, an alert is raised to your adrenal glands, which produces adrenaline and cortisol. And what this does is different organs and different cells listen to those messages. As the bloodstream is flooded with these messenger molecules, the heart starts beating faster because it starts receiving a message saying, hang on, I may need more blood circulating soon. Your lungs expand their airways. Your brain responds to these messages and shuts down non-vital thought processes, makes you more alert. And even your digestive system shuts down. It doesn't want to take any energy away from the fight or flight response that you're going to have. And this is constantly happening throughout your system. You are constantly producing messenger hormones that go around the bloodstream, and any cell membrane can decide to subscribe to that message by just having a receptor that will listen for it. It's not guaranteed that a molecule will come close to it. But given that you have millions of molecules forming every organ, enough of them will get the message and it will start processing. So we also learn. We adapt all the time. And what we're seeing is that it's not just our brains that learn, but we see that our body learns. We see that our body, when it fights a virus, learns how to adapt to that virus quicker the next time. But if we focus on how our brains work, we're brilliant at pattern matching. We're amazing at pattern matching. So when we see something, even if it's something new that we haven't encountered before, it's probably a part of our brain that's matching it against something that in a completely unrelated area that goes, this is similar to this, I'll do that. And so we can train ourselves and learn new skills through concentration, effort, and repetition. We learn to talk by our parents talking to us, and we learn then trying to mimic the sounds that they're making. And we do that continually. It doesn't then take effort for us to then talk to people. Under normal circumstances, we can learn to do most of the things, like walking through town. I don't necessarily have to be concentrating every single time on how many muscles I'm moving and which muscles I'm moving. I can just walk and talk to somebody next to me. But then if they say, what's 2024 times 1712, I'll probably have to stop, because then my runtime has been taken over by doing a very complex operation that my brain is not trained to do. And this is very similar to what happens in machine learning. Machine learning is pattern matching. But we don't have that ability to take the next step. So machine learning as pattern matching means that it's very good at matching what it's been trained. And as I say, we do that all the time. We see something and a response is already forming in our head. We've not consciously thought about it. But then it comes to the conscious part of our brain. And that conscious part of our brain can override that feeling. It can make a conscious decision. It can put the effort in that it needs to work out a better solution or to work out consequences of that solution. So we can override our own biases that's been trained into us. And just like machine learning, If we are raised biased, we will be biased. But we can override that. We can learn ourselves. We can choose to learn ourselves that machine learning cannot do right now. And we can moderate our instinct through how we've developed socially, through learning about empathy and understanding. We should be looking at ways that we can bring that into some of the machine learning world. Because if we can't do that right now in machine learning algorithms, then a human still has to be responsible for the decisions that the machine learning algorithm is making. And we can hopefully train ourselves to be better and train the machines to be better. So what we're seeing is that we have an adaptable standard architecture. That by default, a new species has an immune system. It has an architectural structure that has a skeleton, liver, kidneys, eyes. It forms a variety of different shapes and forms. And this means that, should we be trying to mimic the same? Should we realize that architecture should be flexible? Architecture should give us flexibility. And as I say, you look at the diversity of life that has the standard invertebrate architecture. You look at all of that and you go, can we do the same? Are we too busy trying to reinvent the wheel to realize that the architectures are already out there and that we should be making a good choice? Now, it doesn't mean that we have one architecture, because nature doesn't either. Nature has the architecture of insects, which is different from the architecture of fish, which is the different from the architecture of invertebrates. But by default, we have very successful architectures that can adapt to most scenarios. So it's worth thinking about what our architecture of our systems are, and can we make it easy to build the next system or to extend it very easily by focusing on those architectures. So what can we learn? I think nature teaches us to start simple and iterate. That each generation needs to be viable. If we keep throwing out rubbish, we will end up losing in the marketplace because people will just not use us. We can try multiple variations, not just the first thing that comes into our head. But as we grow in complexity, we need structure. And we should think about standard architectures that are flexible, that are secure by default, and that are pragmatic. We don't have to go for complete purity. We have to be able to adjust to what is needed around us and adjust quickly. Change is going to be inevitable. And if you're not building yourself for change, then you're probably going to become extinct. And we should be better at understanding our biases. But we can apply knowledge and experience into how we change code, into what kind of things we experiment. We can learn from other environments, from other worlds that we've already experienced. We can learn from other people's experience even. People saying, no, don't do that because of this. And you go, oh, yeah, that's fine. We should be cleaning our code and our designs. We should be making sure that we are not hindering ourselves as we move forward, that we are not leaving those weird edge cases that one day could come in to hurt us. We should be understanding our place in our ecosystem, looking around us and understanding what the rest of the world is doing and how the rest of the world is changing. Because at the moment, things are changing quite fast for us. The world is changing really fast, and we need to adapt to what is happening in the world. Who would have thought in the 1920s, just 100 years ago, that typewriters would be just about extinct? But weirdly, we have keyboards that are then based on typewriters. So little bits of the system have still stayed, but the world and the technology that's used to encode data has changed massively. And we should think about testing our systems so that we don't end up with the regressions, so that we don't go backwards and we start moving forwards, so that we can develop faster and more safer. We should be testing them. And so my final thoughts are that many of the problems we face have parallels in nature. We've been thinking about distributed systems, and nature has been building distributed systems for a very long time. And that most creatures are very complex distributed systems in their own right. And that's before we go into how they socialize and communicate with each other en masse, how ant colonies work, how flocks of birds work. I haven't even gone into detail about the structure of the cell. So there's so much more to explore. And I think that we should be taking inspiration from the physical, from the real world, from the natural world, and not trying to always reinvent everything. And that's everything I've got to say. Thank you very much.